Hey guys, welcome to this week's podcast episode. And I've got a very special guest for you today, Elle O'Flaherty. She is an executive coach and performance optimization strategy, and she really caters towards the neurodivergent population with ADHD, which is a really interesting topic in and of itself. And I'm really happy to have her on to share her wisdom, her expertise, and dive right into the conversation. So, Elle, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I know. We always love starting hearing, your journey and how you got to be doing what you're doing and really getting into the meat of the conversation.
Absolutely. I have an interesting career path. I myself am part of the ADHD community. And the first 20 years of my life, I spent as an attorney, primarily litigating World Trade Organization disputes. So anything you want to know about getting chicken into India, I am your girl, which doesn't come up much. But I came to realize that what I really loved was coaching. And I was diagnosed as an adult, as many women of my generation are. And once I started following more what my passions were and my interest, I made this big pivot into starting my own coaching firm, Interlace Solutions. And I started out with helping executives and professionals with more leadership and that sort of thing, which I still do. But I came to find this real gap for high achieving professionals who are also ADHD and might need some coaching and some tools to assist them. And so that's how I ended up here. And it's really been so transformational, both obviously in my professional life, but also learning about ADHD and learning what's normal for us and just the effect that's had on how I live my life day to day and how I think about myself has been tremendous. As you can probably tell, this is my passion, so I could talk about it all day.
Yeah, a really interesting introduction. And typically, when we think of ADHD, when I was growing up, if ADHD, it was like a troublemaker, couldn't stay in school. But actually, growing up, a lot of my classmates in med school had ADHD, and they were the some of the smartest, brightest people I work with. So, what are some like unique traits among ADHD that make you stand out? And also, how do you manage the negative parts in your career or your profession?
Those are great and huge questions. So I'll start with the strengths, which is where I normally like to start. Unfortunately, lots of well-meaning doctors and therapists, teachers will really focus on the negatives, which causes people with ADHD to think that this is some terrible thing. But we're overrepresented in, for instance, emergency rooms, in litigating attorneys and some of these other professions because we are great in an emergency. We tend to, our brain slows down. And whereas some of our neurotypical colleagues and people in our lives will freeze and have trouble in emergencies, that's when we tend to be at our best. And so that is a huge strength. And we also tend to be really creative or great at problem solving. We think outside the box. So we often don't even realize there is a box. So when we're doing things like thinking of new medical procedures or putting together a strategy how to problem solve, that's where we are great and we shine. Of course, there are challenges. I think about it, an analogy I use with a lot of clients is thinking about it if you're left-handed. So ADHD people are as much as 10.4% of the population in the United States. And it's about the same as being left-handed. And there's nothing good or bad about being left-handed. I happen to be, so this resonates with me. But when you try to open a can, for instance, as a left-handed person, a right-handed can opener is challenging. It's basically mechanically impossible to use with your left hand. But once you have a left-handed can opener, all of a sudden everything gets easier. And it's so similar with ADHD. It's that we're often taught how to do things in a way that works for neurotypical people. But once we start doing it in ways that work with our brain, suddenly everything becomes so much easier. And that's really where I come into play. What you're describing also with your colleagues from med school is really interesting. In the community, we call that 2E. People are twice exceptional. They're both really gifted with intelligence and also with ADHD. These are some of the real fireballs in this world, people who are inventors and starting companies and doing all sorts of things. So these are some of the people that we absolutely want to support and make sure that we don't discourage or miss out on their exceptional abilities, which can be what happens when we discourage kids or when we don't tell them all the great things about ADHD.
Mm. Yeah, which kind of brings me to my next point is a lot of my colleagues, some of the best surgeons, just stellar careers, they wisened up in school. They realized they were a bit different and they leveraged their strengths and minimized their weaknesses. But a lot of people I know growing up ADHD or different and they got beaten down and told they wouldn't amount to anything. And so how do you prevent this type of the system, which I think is quite antiquated from how do you get out of the bind? If you make it out of the system, you shine, but it's how do you get out of it first?
Good question. And first, can we just all acknowledge how awful that is to have a kid feel that way? It's terrible. Uh, any kid. I think, first of all, it's an education component. I am a professional speaker. I speak to a lot of organizations. I also speak at a lot of conferences for doctors, for therapists, for other folks to help them understand this upside. I've noticed that at least in talking to some of these mental health professionals, that most of the training on ADHD that they'll ever receive is about 20 minutes in med school or when they're pursuing their PhD. And it's almost entirely focused on the negative traits. So it gives this really bad footing for the information, which I think is really problematic. So one of the things is really encouraging some of these folks who are in mental health, teachers, others, to get more training and especially to hear from people like me who have the lived experience and also understand the upside. I find that once people have that understanding, I also find this with some of my clients' partners, other people that I work with, their bosses, certainly, will react really differently once they understand ADHD and what's going on. And they tend to appreciate those upsides that it sounds like you organically found, noticing what some of your colleagues were good at. And I love that you did that, by the way. But yeah, I think that that's one of the first things is teaching the people around us. Then I think the second thing is helping people. And this is a huge thing that I do with my adult clients. I don't actually work with children, but connecting ADHD people to our community and helping us to understand what's normal for us is so powerful. Um, Most of the people who come to me with ADHD, they think they're the only ones. They think there's something terribly wrong with them and that they're the problem.
Hmm.
And when I start saying that's normal for us, and in our community, that's average. That's how most of us respond or behave or whatever it is. It really takes a lot of the power and the shame out of those things that they might have been bottling up for their entire lives. So I think that's really important. And that shame, by the way, is one of my main drivers for what I do. ADHD, more than 90% of neurotypical people have a negative association with ADHD. It's actually one of the most stigmatized mental differences out there.
Mhm.
And when I work with organizations, a big thing that I do is to give that understanding of ADHD and also to understand that the things that they are assuming are negative attributes or that somehow a worker is being lazy or whatever it is,
Hmm.
that is absolutely not true. And then teaching them skills to work with colleagues or staff or whomever in their organization so that they can support them instead of perpetuating that stigma. I think that's really important.
Yeah, it sounds like in order to survive, I survived, but it was not without. It's like the system could be a lot better. And it sounds like once you understand where you fit in, you can navigate and be smarter about when you're dealing with neurotypical individuals. And which leads me to my next question is embracing quirks for professional success. And you advocate embracing just idiosyncrasies and share examples of how quirks can be harnessed to make someone a better or effective leader, professional executive.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, First, I have a question for you, if you don't mind. I thought I saw you nodding when I was talking about people's experience in their education about ADHD. When you were going through school, did you get much training on ADHD, or I'd love to hear what your experience was.
You mean in my earlier non-professional before undergrad or just or so I
Or in
can
your professional training?
we typically the DSM-4 and or whatever the criteria and like kind of the treatment, but never really how do you thrive or how do you stand out? Like how do you embrace neurodiversity, these types of things? What do you do and how do you leverage your strengths in the profession or and how do you minimize your weaknesses? That was never taught, but just more of the systematic, what is ADHD? These are the criteria, this is the diagnosis, this is treatment. but never like how do you fit in? How do you survive? How do you thrive? These types of things never were never taught.
Yeah, and isn't that unfortunate? And it's most ADHD people, they're diagnosed by a psychiatrist or another mental health professional. So they'll get that medication piece if they want it.
Mhm.
Then they might talk to a therapist who has similar training to what you're describing. But a lot of them never hear the positive sides and they never actually talk to someone who also has ADHD. And
Mhm.
I just think that's a real failing. But what's your perspective in the medical community?
Like I said, it's more of a negative stigma, and it's just it's good. It's has negative connotations, and but I like I said, it was always a dichotomy because I would see people with ADHD really excel in their careers, either as scientists or just because they were able to be more creative, they could be hyper focused, and they leverage that. That some of the my colleagues are department chairs and really respected surgeons, and they have ADHD. They just learn to leverage it. And but then even growing up, this idea of ADHD was like the unruly, disruptive, but there was no official. Like I said, I think it's, those people that make it out of the traditional system, like I said, will continue to excel, but there's a large proportion that just, get beat down by the system. So,
Yeah, I think you're so right. And you just touched on a really interesting point where now under the DSM-5, there are three subtypes. And so a lot of people still use the term ADD, which actually doesn't exist any longer. The three subtypes are inattentive, hyperactive, impulsive, and then combined, which is, hey, that's me. That's about 60% of us. And the hyperactive impulsive type, or that's what you're describing, that sort of 7-year-old boy is bouncing off the walls in class. And those are the people who tend to get diagnosed. But a lot of folks don't realize the inattentive type can present completely differently. It's much more common in women and girls and in adults than in children. And these are the folks who are like daydreamers, who are caught in their own thoughts. They might not hear you when you're talking to them right away. Sometimes these are the people who are a little more forgetful and lose things. And the fact that combined type can present with both these things. And so that really, I think, contributes to missing the diagnosis for a lot of particularly women and girls, and not understanding how that very different subtype can present, especially if we are socialized to mask a lot of our traits. So, for instance, in the United States, the way that we are diagnosed primarily is through a symptoms inventory that was developed by Harvard Medical School and the WHO. And in my opinion, it's really biased towards folks who are hyperactive type. And I really think we need to revise that and think about it. In other countries, like in the United Kingdom, people are being diagnosed through eye tracking software
Mhm.
because when we read, our eyes jump around the page, reading in lines like neurotypical folks do.
Mhm.
Anyway, I'm getting off topic, but I just think it's really interesting this sort of cascade of not giving enough and proper teaching about what we now understand about ADHD and how that has downstream impacts. And to your original question that I'm sorry I passed right by, but this is so teachable and the skills and tools that I teach people. So just for instance, when I'm working with adults and professionals, we are never taught how to motivate our brain, right? So neurotypical folks have importance-based brains. They rank the things they need to do by importance based on to them, to their partner, to their boss, whomever. But we don't actually have that functionality. We have interest-based brains, which is why ooh shiny makes us want to do things. And so understanding that we have completely different drivers and motivations. There are basically 5 ways to motivate an ADHD brain. And I use the mnemonic funky, not spelled right, please forgive me. But the 5 ways are fun, urgency, novelty, challenge, and interest. And most ADHD people organically come to urgency. So that's the paper's due in the morning. So I guess I'll start writing it tonight. But that's really the most stressful way to motivate ourselves. And it actually makes us feel bad. And so teaching people what the other motivators are and some of the tools underneath each one and how to leverage those, it just really changes how we go about our lives and how we're able to perform and helps to eliminate some stress. So you had a great question there about what kind of ways and what are some of the practical changes that we can make as ADHD people. And that's just an example of one of them.
Mhm. Yeah. I know we have a couple minutes left, and what constant, this talking about productivity and ever-changing work environment, and we've got remote work now, and we got digital nomads, and we're having more people become entrepreneurs and self-employed. So how do you see productivity evolving, and how can organizations better support their teams? And, a lot of people with ADHD, they're like, yeah, this system doesn't work for me. I'm going to go create my own culture. I'm going to go create my own company. How do you see that evolving?
Good question. That is one of the big things that I'm hired by organizations to do is to go in and help to teach about productivity, sometimes ADHD specific, sometimes not. Folks who are ADHD are 300% more likely to be entrepreneurs. It's really actually where we shine because we can set up our business and our environment and way of working to follow our interests, which is so critically important for us. We're also able to use work in the way that works for us. So because of our interest-based brains, if a tool or a system or whatever isn't interesting to us, it's going to be really hard to get us to do it. We'll have to force ourselves. It's very unpleasant. Looking at that on a macro level and not just for folks who are ADHD, but looking at the different levers that we can pull, the different tools we can use. As we all know, there's basically an app for everything at this point, and being creative in how we go about doing our work in a way that works for us instead of a way that works against our natural propensities and our brain is, I think it's something that is going to become more and more critical as we're moving forward. And I'm hoping more and more embraced as people understand and corporations understand the huge benefits of facilitating productivity instead of trying to dictate it.
How can people find out more about you if they want to get more information, resources, coaching, even I think if their kids are struggling with it and they need help as well, how can they find out more about you?
Well, thanks for asking. My website is interlacesolutions.com. I have a team of coaches who I've handpicked and trained. They are wonderful. We're absolutely ready to help. But you can schedule a consultation there, either for coaching or if you're interested in maybe a speaking event or some corporate help on the larger scale, then we're here. Also, I have a newsletter that is absolutely free, and people should feel free to sign up. I give tips that introduce the hot new tools and things that are coming out. And of course, I write longer form articles about different things that are coming up for ADHD folks. That's a free way to get supported. But yeah, please do reach out.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation, and this idea of neurodiversity really hasn't entered in until recently, and it's an interesting concept. Uh, and for all the audience, be sure to follow Elle's resources, give her socials a like and follow, and thanks so much for a fascinating conversation.
Thank you. This is a lot of fun. I